Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood alone on the observation deck of the UE's Olive Branch, her hands clasped behind her back as she watched Earth grow smaller and smaller through the reinforced glass window that stretched from floor to ceiling in front of her. The blue marble that had been home to her ancestors for countless generations was now nothing more than a tiny speck of light among billions of other stars. And she wondered if she would ever see it again with her own eyes behind her flagship. 47 vessels followed in perfect formation through the cold darkness of space, their engines glowing like a string of pearls against the infinite black canvas of the universe. These were not warships designed for destruction and conquest, but science vessels filled with researchers and doctors, medical frigates carrying enough supplies to heal entire cities, and diplomatic carriers that housed the finest negotiators humanity had ever produced. This was the fleet that the United Earthsand had assembled after 80 months of horror and death. 18 months of watching breath bombs fall on human colonies like rain from a poisoned sky. Admiral Tanaka could still remember the day the attacks began, when she had been stationed at the Mars defense grid and received the first distress calls from the outer colonies. The messages had been filled with screaming and confusion, with desperate pleas for help that went unanswered because no one understood what was happening or why the Wrath had appeared from nowhere, their ships emerging from faster-than-light travel with weapons already firing. And they had shown no mercy to anyone they encountered. Men and women and children had died by the billions. Their cities turned to glass and ash by orbital bombardments that lasted for days without pause. Colony after colony fell silent, their final transmissions cutting off mid-sentence as the Wrath fleet moved on to find new targets among the scattered human settlements. And through all of it, through all the death and destruction and grief that followed, the Wrath had never once explained why they were doing this terrible thing to a species they had never met before. There were no demands for territory or resources, no ultimatums delivered through diplomatic channels, no warnings or threats or attempts at communication of any kind. They simply arrived and they killed and they left, moving through human space like a plague of locusts that consumed everything in its path. When the attacks finally stopped and the Wrath fleet retreated back to their own territory, humanity had been left with nothing but questions and a burning desire for revenge. The military commanders had wanted to strike back immediately with every weapon at their disposal, including the planet cracker bombs that had been built in secret during the darkest days of the war. These terrible weapons could shatter a world into pieces, turning entire planets into fields of floating debris. And many in the Senate had argued that the Wrath deserved nothing less for what they had done. But when the final vote was cast in the great chamber beneath the mountains of Switzerland, humanity chose a different path forward. They chose to ask why Admiral Tanaka had volunteered for the mission before anyone else could raise their hand, knowing full well that most people considered it nothing more than an elaborate form of suicide. Her own brother had called her crazy. When she told him about her decision, his face twisted with grief and anger as he reminded her that their parents had died on New Helsinki when the Wrath bombs fell. How could she possibly want to make peace with the monsters who had murdered their family along with so many others? He had demanded to know. She had no easy answer for him then, and she still had no easy answer now. Only a feeling deep in her chest that told her this was the right thing to do. Perhaps it was because she had seen too much death already and could not bear the thought of adding more bodies to the pile that stretched across the stars. Perhaps it was because she believed that understanding the enemy was more important than destroying them, especially when that enemy had shown capabilities far beyond anything humanity possessed. Or perhaps it was simply because someone had to take the first step towards something better, and she was tired of waiting for someone else to be brave enough to do it. 3 weeks into their journey through the void between stars, The fleet crossed the invisible line that marked the border of Wreth territory. Every ship in the formation had powered down its weapons systems before making the crossing. Their shields lowered and their targeting computers offline. It was the ultimate gesture of trust and vulnerability. An invitation for the Wreth to destroy them all, if that was what they truly wanted. Admiral Tanaka had ordered every vessel to broadcast the same message on all known frequencies, repeating it endlessly in every language they knew, and several they'd only guessed that we come without hostility, and we seek only to understand. The message said, over and over again, until the words lost all meaning and became nothing more than a rhythm in the background noise. For 6 hours they traveled deeper into enemy space, without any response. And some of the crew began to wonder if the Wreth had abandoned this region entirely. Then the sensors detected movement ahead. Dozens of contacts emerging from behind a nearby asteroid field where they had been waiting in silence. Wreth interceptors, their hulls covered in the strange organic patterns that made their ships look almost alive, surrounded the human fleet within minutes. Admiral Tanaka watched them take up positions around her vessels, their weapons clearly charged and ready to fire at a moment's notice. She did not give the order to raise shields or power up weapons, even when her first officer strongly suggested that they should prepare for the worst. Instead, she simply waited, her heart pounding in her chest as the seconds stretched into minutes and the universe held its breath. The lead Wreth interceptor moved closer to the olive branch, close enough that Tanaka could see the strange symbols etched into its hull through the viewport. Then a communication channel opened, and a voice like grinding stone filled the bridge. Speaking in broken but understandable human language, you will follow, the voice commanded. And the Wreth ships began to move deeper into their territory. Admiral Tanaka gave the order to comply without hesitation, and the human fleet fell into formation behind their escorts. They were being led somewhere, she realized, towards something that no outsider had ever been allowed to see before. Whatever lay ahead would either mean their salvation or their doom. But at least they would finally have the answers they had traveled so far to find. The stars wheeled slowly past the viewport as the combined fleet moved through the darkness. Human and Wreth ships flying together for the first time in history, and somewhere in the distance, hidden among those unfamiliar constellations, the planet called Wreth Prime waited for them with secrets that would change everything they thought they knew about this war. The planet that appeared on the view screen was nothing like what Admiral Tanaka had expected to find at the heart of enemy territory. She had prepared herself for a fortress, world bristling with weapons and defenses, a gleaming center of military power that would explain how the Wreth had been able to strike so hard and so fast against human colonies. What she saw instead made her breath catch in her throat, and her hands gripped the railing in front of her until her knuckles turned white. Wreth Prime was dying. The world that filled this observation window was a pale shadow of what it must have once been, its continents covered in the gray and brown colors of decay rather than the greens and blues of life. Vast cities that had once reached toward the sky now lay dark and crumbling, their towers broken and their streets empty of the millions who had lived there in better times. The oceans had pulled back from their shores and left behind nothing but toxic sludge that poisoned everything it touched, killing whatever creatures had survived the initial catastrophe, even from orbit. Tanaka could see that the atmosphere was thin and sickly, filled with clouds that looked more like bruises on the face of a beaten child. This was not the homeworld of conquerors and destroyers. She realized with growing horror, this was a graveyard. The Wreth escort commander agreed to meet with her aboard the olive branch after she made the request through the communication channel, and she waited in the conference room with her senior officers while security protocols were completed. When the alien finally entered the room, Tanaka had to force herself not to stare at the creature who had escorted them through. Hostile Space Orc Val was tall and gaunt, His gray skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too sharp, and his 4 eyes sunken deep into a face that showed the marks of long suffering. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to conserve every bit of energy. And when he sat down across from the human delegation, his breathing was labored and rough. This was not a warrior in his prime. Tanaka understood immediately. This was a survivor clinging to life with whatever strength remained to him. "You came unarmed," Torek said through the translator device that converted his grinding voice into words the humans could understand. His 4 eyes moved across the faces of the officers assembled before him, searching for something that he clearly did not expect to find. "We did not expect this," he continued. And there was something almost like confusion in his alien features. Admiral Tanaka leaned forward in her chair and met his gaze without flinching, even though every instinct told her to look away from those strange and unsettling eyes. "We came to ask why you attacked us," she said in a voice that was calm and steady despite the emotions churning inside her chest. "We had never met your kind before the bombing began, and we still do not understand what we did to earn such hatred from your people." Torek was silent for a long moment, his 4 eyes blinking slowly as he processed her words and considered how to respond. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight of exhaustion that seemed to press down on everyone in the room. "You truly do not know," he said, and it was not a question, but a statement of realization that seemed to shake him to his core. "Know what?" Tanaka demanded, frustration bleeding into her voice despite her best efforts to remain diplomatic. "What is it that we are supposed to know that would explain why you murder billions of innocent people who had never done anything to harm you?" Alien rose from his chair and gestured for her to follow him, moving toward a data terminal built into the wall of the conference room. The other human officers tensed and reached for weapons they did not have, but Tanaka waved them back and followed the breath. "Commander," without hesitation, Torek activated the terminal with a series of gestures that his long fingers performed with practiced ease, and images began to appear on the screen before them. 300 years ago, he began, his voice taking on the tone of someone reciting a history they had memorized through endless repetition. "My people ruled an empire of 12 star systems. We were explorers and builders and dreamers who looked at the universe with wonder and hope, believing that the future held nothing but promise for our children and their children." After them, Tanaka watched the images scroll past, showing cities of impossible beauty and ships that sailed between the stars like silver fish swimming through a cosmic ocean. Then came the Harrow, Torek continued, and his voice grew heavy with a grief that transcended language and species. The images changed to show something very different, something that made Tanaka's stomach turn with revulsion and pity. Bodies lay in the streets of those beautiful cities, their gray skin covered in black lesions that spread like shadows across their flesh. Children cried over the corpses of their parents, while doctors worked frantically with equipment that was clearly inadequate to face the horror that had been unleashed upon them. "The Harrow was a plague," Torek explained, "a synthetic disease engineered by a species called the Chiron, who wanted our territory and saw us as nothing more than obstacles to be removed. It attacked our biology in ways we could not fight, mutating just fast enough to evade any cure we developed while killing us slowly enough to give us hope before crushing it. The Chiron sat back and watched as we died by the billions, waiting patiently for the Harrow to finish what they had started." Tanaka felt tears forming in her eyes as she watched the historical records play out before her, showing a civilization being destroyed not by war but by biological weapons that turned their own bodies against them within 50 years. Torek said, "We were reduced to this single dying world and a handful of warships crewed by survivors who had nowhere else to go. Our scientists were dead, our medical knowledge destroyed, our hope extinguished like a candle in a hurricane. And then the Chiron came to us with a warning. He continued, his voice now bitter with old anger and fresh understanding. They told us that a new species had risen in a distant part of the galaxy. A violent and aggressive race called humanity that would surely finish what the Harrow had begun. They showed us your broadcasts, your wars, your weapons, your capacity for destruction against your own kind. They showed us treaties and agreements between your government and theirs. Evidence of an alliance that would spell our final doom, and we believed them. Torek Val finished. Because we had no reason not to believe them, and every reason to fear that our extinction was finally at hand. Tanaka stared at the alien commander with a mixture of horror and dawning understanding, her mind racing to process what she had just learned. The Vreth had not attacked humanity out of hatred or conquest. They had attacked because they believed they were defending themselves against an enemy that did not exist. We have never even heard of the Chiron, she whispered, and the words felt inadequate to express the enormity of the deception that had been practiced against both their people. Torek Val turned to face her, and for the first time she saw something other than hostility or suspicion in his 4 eyes. She saw the beginning of doubt, the first crack in a wall of lies that had been built 3 centuries ago by monsters who had played 2 innocent species against each other for their own benefit. Dr. Samuel Okonkwo had not slept in 72 hours, but his hands remained steady as he manipulated the holographic display that floated above his workstation in the medical bay of the Olive Branch. The samples of the Harrow plague that the Vreth had reluctantly provided were unlike anything he had ever seen in his 30 years of studying diseases across a dozen different worlds. The synthetic pathogen was elegant in its cruelty, a masterpiece of biological engineering designed by minds that understood suffering and had chosen to weaponize it against an entire species. It attacked the Vreth immune system with surgical precision, hiding in their cells like a predator waiting to strike before emerging to destroy everything it touched. Every time, the Vreth scientists had developed a treatment that showed promise. The plague had mutated just enough to render their work useless. It was as if the disease could think, could plan, could anticipate the efforts of those who sought to defeat it and stay 1 step ahead of them forever. But Dr. Okonkwo was not. Vreth scientist working with limited resources and dying hope. He was a human being with access to 3 centuries of medical advances that the Chiron had never anticipated when they created their weapon of genocide. The Harrow had been designed to destroy Vreth biology and Vreth biology alone, with no consideration given to what might happen if another species encountered it and decided to help. Admiral Tanaka found him in his laboratory, surrounded by screens filled with genetic sequences and molecular diagrams, his dark skin covered in a sheen of sweat and his eyes bright with the fire of discovery. "What have you found?" she asked, knowing from the expression on his face that the news would be significant. Dr. Okonkwo turned to face her with a grin that seemed almost inappropriate given the circumstances. But she understood the joy of a scientist who had finally cracked an impossible puzzle. "It is a puzzle," he said, gesturing at the displays around him with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and excitement. "Complicated one, yes, but still a puzzle that can be solved if you have the right tools and the willingness to use them." He pulled up a comparison chart that showed human gene therapy techniques alongside Vreth biological data, highlighting connections that only an expert could have noticed. Whoever made this plague never imagined that anyone would share medical knowledge freely, he explained, pointing at specific markers on the chart that lit up in response to his touch. The Chiron designed the Harrow to defeat Vreth medicine, which means they studied Vreth research methods and created a disease that would always be 1 step ahead of their capabilities. But they never studied human medicine because they assumed we would be enemies who would never work together. Our CRISPR-9 Gene therapy approaches the problem from an angle that the Harrow was never designed to anticipate. Dr. Okonkwo requested access to the Vreth medical archives so he could compare his findings with their historical research. And what he discovered there made him weep. The Chiron had not simply released a plague upon the Vreth people. They had systematically destroyed every institution that might have developed a cure, bombing research facilities and assassinating scientists, until nothing remained but fragments of knowledge and desperate guesswork. The Vreth had been fighting blind against an enemy they could not see or understand, and the Chiron had made sure it would stay that way forever. Meanwhile, in another part of the ship, Lieutenant Commander Priya Sharma led a team of intelligence analysts in a different kind of investigation. They had been given access to Vreth communication records dating back 300 years. And what they found confirmed the worst suspicions that Admiral Tanaka had begun to form. The evidence of Chiron manipulation was overwhelming once you knew what to look for. There were forged transmissions that showed human military commanders discussing alliance terms with Chiron representatives, complete with signatures and official seals that had been fabricated with expert precision. There were doctored broadcasts from Earth that had been edited to show only war crimes and nuclear explosions, carefully removing any context that might have suggested humanity was capable of compassion or cooperation. There were fake treaties and agreements and diplomatic communications, an entire history of human-Chiron friendship that had been manufactured from nothing and delivered to the dying Vreth. As proof of their imminent destruction, Lieutenant Commander Sharma compiled their findings into a comprehensive report and presented it to Admiral Tanaka and Torekval together, wanting both of them to see the truth at the same time. "They wanted us to kill each other," she said, her voice flat with controlled anger as she walked them through the evidence piece by piece. The Vreth would attack humanity because they believed we were allied with the monsters who had murdered their civilization. We would respond with overwhelming force because we had no idea why we were being attacked and would assume the worst in the end. Both species would be weakened or destroyed, and the Chiron would move into whatever territory remained. It was a perfect plan, she continued, and the only reason it failed was because our Senate decided to send peace envoys instead of planet crackers. Torekval stood in silence as the evidence was presented, his four eyes moving across the fabricated documents that his people had accepted as truth for 3 centuries. When the presentation ended, he did not speak for a long time, and Tanaka could only imagine the storm of emotions that must have been raging inside his alien mind. "My people died because of lies," he finally said, his voice hollow with shock and grief. "We killed your people because of lies, an entire war built on nothing but deception and hatred. And we were too desperate to see through it." Admiral Tanaka placed her hand on his arm in a gesture of comfort that she hoped would translate across the gap between their species. "We were both victims of the same enemy," she said gently. "The only question now is what we choose to do about it." She authorized a full data share with the Vreth, holding nothing back and hiding nothing from their former enemies. Every piece of evidence that Lieutenant Commander Sharma had compiled was transferred to Vreth systems, along with unedited human broadcasts that showed the full picture of what humanity truly was. Torekval watched those broadcasts with his officers, seeing for the first time the images that the Chiron had hidden from his people. Children laughing in playgrounds while their parents watched with love in their ice cities, rebuilding after natural disasters, with volunteers from across the world coming together to help strangers they had never met. Scientists sharing discoveries freely with anyone who wanted to learn, believing that knowledge belonged to everyone. Artists creating beauty for no reason other than the joy of creation itself. These were not the monsters he had been taught to fear. These were people, flawed and complicated and capable of both great cruelty and great kindness, just like his own species had been before the Harrow stole their future. The wall of lies was crumbling, and behind it Torekval could finally see the truth that they Chiron had worked so hard to hide humanity was not the enemy. Humanity might be the only hope his dying people had left. It took 6 weeks of endless work and sleepless nights and collaboration between species who had been killing each other. Just months before, Dr. Okonkwo led a team of human researchers who worked alongside the handful of Reth scientists who had survived the centuries of plague and despair. They argued and debated and shared ideas across the barrier of language and biology, pushing each other to think in new ways and consider possibilities that neither species would have discovered alone. The cure they developed was not perfect and could not undo 300 years of death and suffering. It could not bring back the billions who had died in agony, while the billions who had died in agony. Chiron watched from the safety of their distant empire. But it could stop the dying. It could give the Reth something they had not possessed since before the harrow first appeared in their blood. It could give them hope. The first patient to receive the treatment was a child named Sulith, a small gray creature with 4 eyes that were too large for her thin face and limbs that looked like they might snap from the weight of her own body. She was 7 years old and had been given 3 months to live by doctors who had seen too many children die to pretend that miracles were possible. Her mother held her hand as Dr. Okonkwo administered the injection, and the fear in those alien eyes was something that transcended species and culture and language. It was simply the fear of a parent watching their child face death and being unable to do anything to stop it. For 3 days, Sulith lay in the hospital bed while human and Reth medical staff monitored her vital signs and adjusted the treatment. Based on her responses, her fever spiked and dropped and spiked again. And there were moments when everyone in the room thought they had failed despite all their efforts. But on the 4th day, something changed. Black lesions that had covered her gray skin began to fade, retreating like shadows before the rising sun, until only faint marks remained where death had once been spreading. Her breathing grew stronger, and her eyes grew brighter, and color returned to cheeks that had been pale with sickness for as long as anyone could remember. On the 7th day after receiving the cure, Sulith climbed out of her hospital bed and ran through the corridors of the medical facility. Her laughter echoed off walls that had not heard such a sound in generations, filling the building with a music that seemed almost impossible in a place that had known only grief and silence. Reth doctors and nurses stopped in their tracks to watch her pass, tears streaming down their gray faces as they witnessed something they had stopped believing could ever happen. A child who would live, a child who would grow up and have children of her own and pass on the gift of survival to future generations. A child who was proof that the harrow could be defeated. The news spread across Reth Prime like wildfire through dry grass, carried from city to city by communications networks that had been used for nothing but announcements of death for centuries. People emerged from their crumbling homes and gathered in the empty streets, looking up at the sky where the human fleet still orbited their dying world. They did not cheer or celebrate, for they had forgotten how to express joy after so many years of learning only sorrow. But they looked up with something new in their eyes, something that sparkled like starlight reflected in deep water. They looked up with hope. Torek Val found Admiral Tanaka in the small chapel aboard the Olive Branch, a quiet room where crew members of all faiths came to reflect and pray and seek comfort in whatever form they believed it took. She was sitting alone in the dim light, her head bowed and her hands folded in her lap, and he approached her with footsteps that were deliberately loud so as not to startle her. "Why?" he asked, and the single word carried the weight of every question he had been unable to articulate since the humans first arrived in orbit around his world. "We killed your people," he continued, his voice rough with emotions. He did not know how to express billions of them, innocent men and women and children, who had done nothing to deserve the death we brought to their doorsteps. We showed no mercy and asked for no understanding. And we would have continued killing until there was no one left if your fleet had not come to stop us. So why would you save us? Admiral Tanaka looked up at him with eyes that held neither anger nor judgment, only a sadness that seemed to encompass the entire tragedy of their shared history. She was silent for a long time, considering her answer carefully before speaking. Because someone lied to you, she finally said, a voice soft but steady in the quiet chapel. You were victims just as much as we were, manipulated by creatures who saw both our peoples as nothing more than tools to be used and discarded if we had come here with weapons and vengeance. If we had done to your world what you did to our colonies, we would only be proving that the Chiron were right about us. We would be proving that humanity is exactly what they told you we were. She paused and reached into her pocket, pulling out a small device that she handed to Torekval with a gesture of offering the cruelest thing we could do. She continued, is prove them right? The kindest thing we can do is prove them wrong. Torekval looked down at the device in his hands, a standard datapad that contained a single document marked with the seal of the United Earth's entity. Activated it and read the contents, his 4 eyes moving across the text, while his breath caught in his throat. It was a proposal for full cooperation between humanity and the Vreth people. Medical support that would continue until the Harrow was completely eradicated from their population. Agricultural assistance that would help them restore their poisoned farmlands and feed their starving survivors. Shared colonial rights in 3 uninhabited star systems where the Vreth could rebuild their civilization without fear of attack. There were no conditions attached to the offer, no demands for territory or resources or submission, no requirements for reparations or punishment for the war that had claimed so many human lives. It was simply a gift, freely given by a people who had every right to demand vengeance and had chosen instead to offer mercy. This is not peace, Torekval said, his voice cracking as he struggled to comprehend what he was holding in his hands. This is mercy, Admiral. Tanaka rose from her seat and stood before him, close enough to touch but maintaining a respectful distance that acknowledged the gulf between their peoples. It is both, she replied simply. The Vreth commander stood in silence for a long moment, the datapad trembling slightly in his grasp as he processed the enormity of what humanity was offering his dying species. Then, slowly and deliberately, he lowered his head in a gesture of respect that transcended the boundaries between their cultures. On behalf of my people, he said, I accept your mercy, and I will spend whatever remains of my life making sure that we are worthy of it. The formal peace treaty was signed on the bridge of the Olive Branch, while cameras broadcast the ceremony across both human and Vreth communication networks. Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood on one side of the table that had been set up for the occasion, a dress uniform pressed and her medals gleaming under the bright light. Torekval stood on the other side, his gray skin still marked by the faint scars of the Harrow, but his 4 eyes bright with something that looked remarkably like happiness. Behind them stood representatives from both species, humans and Vreth, who had learned to work together during the long weeks of developing the cure and uncovering the truth about the Chiron deception. They watched in silence as the 2 leaders signed their names to the document that would officially end a war between their peoples, a war that had been built on nothing but lies and manipulation. When the last signature was complete, Admiral Tanaka reached across the table and extended her hand to Torekval in a gesture of friendship that had been practiced by humans for thousands of years. He hesitated for only a moment, unfamiliar with the custom but understanding its meaning, before grasping her hand with his own long fingers. The image of their joined hands was captured by the cameras and transmitted across the stars, reaching billions of viewers who watched with tears in their eyes as enemies became allies. But Admiral Tanaka was not finished. She she had one more message to send before the fleet began its long journey back to Earth. A message that would travel not to human or Vreth receivers, but to a distant corner of the galaxy, where monsters lived in comfort while their victims suffered, with Torek Val's blessing and the full support of the combined human-Vreth delegation. She directed the communication arrays of every ship in the fleet toward Chiron Space 47 vessels focused their transmitters together, combining their power into a single signal that would punch through the void with enough strength to reach across a dozen star systems. The message they sent was simple but devastating. First came a complete and unedited evidence of Chiron manipulation. Every forged document and fabricated broadcast that Lieutenant Commander Shama and her team had uncovered during their investigation, the fake treaties and the doctored videos and the manufactured correspondence were laid bare for anyone to see. Proof beyond doubt that the Chiron had engineered a war between two innocent species for their own benefit. Second came the medical database containing the cure for the Harrow Plague, offered freely to any species that the Chiron had victimized in similar fashion over the centuries. If there were other peoples out there who had been attacked with biological weapons and left to die while the Chiron watched, they would now have the tools to fight back against the death sentence they had been given. Third came a statement from humanity, words that Admiral Tanaka had written herself during a sleepless night, when she thought about all the lives that had been lost because of Chiron cruelty. We know what you did. The message began, and we know what you are. You are not conquerors or warriors or rulers of anything worth ruling. You are cowards who hide behind plagues and lies because you lack the courage to face your enemies openly. The Vreth are no longer your weapon, and they are no longer alone. Every species you have deceived and poisoned and betrayed will receive this message along with the evidence of your crimes. We are not coming for you with warships or weapons of mass destruction. We are coming with the truth, and we will keep coming until every corner of this galaxy knows that cruelty is not strength, and that you are not as powerful as you pretend to be. The transmission ended, and the fleet began its journey home, leaving behind a world that was already beginning to heal and a people who finally had reason to believe in tomorrow. Admiral Tanaka stood on the observation deck as Vreth Prime grew smaller in the distance, watching until it was nothing more than a tiny point of light among the countless stars. She did not know what the future would bring or how the Chiron would respond to the message that had been sent into their space. Perhaps they would ignore it and continue their schemes, confident that no one would be brave enough to challenge them directly. Perhaps they would strike back against humanity with weapons and forces that made the Vreth attacks look like gentle rain. Or perhaps, just perhaps, the truth would spread faster than any army could march, and any fleet could fly 6 months after the fleet returned to Earth. Reports began arriving from the borders of Chiron territory. 3 of their outer worlds had declared independence from the Empire, their populations rising up against their government after receiving the transmission from humanity. The evidence of Chiron crimes against the Vreth had resonated with species who had their own memories of Chiron cruelty, their own suspicions about plagues that had mysteriously appeared in their populations at convenient times. Within a year, the Chiron Empire faced revolts on 14 different fronts, each one sparked by the information that humanity had freely shared with anyone who wanted to receive it. These were not human soldiers fighting on distant battlefields or human ships bombarding enemy positions. These were the Chiron's own victims, finally given the tools and knowledge they needed to fight back against the monsters who had tormented them for centuries. Admiral Tanaka had not fired a single shot during her mission to Vreth Prime. She had not destroyed a single enemy vessel, or conquered a single world, or killed a single enemy combatant, and yet she had done more damage to the Chiron Empire than 1,000 battle fleets could have accomplished through force, alone because she had understood something that the Chiron, with all their cunning and cruelty, had never been able to comprehend. The strongest weapon in the universe was not a bomb or a plague or a carefully constructed lie. It was the truth, freely shared and freely given to anyone brave enough to use it. 10 years after the peace treaty was signed, a young breath woman named Saleith graduated from the University of New Geneva with a degree in xenomedicine. She was the first of her kind to study at a human institution. But she would not be the last. Her graduation ceremony was attended by humans and Vreth alike, standing together as friends and colleagues who had learned that their differences were far less important than what they had in common. When she stepped up to receive her diploma, Saleith paused to address the assembled crowd with words that would be remembered long after the ceremony ended. She spoke of the crew of the Olive Branch and the choice they had made to seek understanding instead of revenge. She spoke of Dr. Okonkwo and the cure that had saved her life and the lives of millions of her people. She spoke of Admiral Tanaka and the message that had been sent to the Chiron, a message that had toppled an empire without shedding a single drop of blood. And she spoke of the simple idea that she had learned from humanity during her years living among them, an idea that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The strongest fleet, she said, is the one that arrives with open hands. The audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause. Human and Vreth standing together in celebration of a future that neither species could have imagined. Just a decade before, somewhere in the crowd, Admiral Yuki Tanaka watched with tears streaming down her face and a smile spreading across her lips. This was why she had volunteered for that suicide mission so many years ago. This was why she had chosen mercy over vengeance and truth over violence. This was the future that humanity had built, not with weapons and conquest, but with compassion and courage and the simple belief that even the deepest wounds could heal if someone was willing to take the first step towards something better. And as she watched Saleith accept her diploma and wave to the cheering crowd, Tanaka knew that step had been worth taking. It had been worth everything.